enlightenment is rather short in two senses. One, in the sense of this weekend, not a lot of time, and also in the sense that we are running out of time in our lives, that we are getting older, more infirm, the body is breaking apart, the mind is losing its faculties. So this is our opportunity to make that effort now to understand the Dhamma. And so in this session I wanted to look at some suttas that talk about what enlightenment is. And I mentioned this very briefly last night. It's really important to know what the Buddha was talking about when he talked about enlightenment, so that we're able to understand what the goal is that we're aiming for. And also so that we're not misled by people perhaps trying to redefine this experience. And I mentioned before that there's a lot of internet arahants out there who tell us this is enlightenment, that is enlightenment, or what I mean by enlightenment is this, or awakening is this. And so we need to be able to distinguish those kinds of claims from what the Buddha talked about when he talked about enlightenment. Otherwise, there's a potential for us, as I said last night, to take a wrong turn on this journey. And if we take a wrong turn, we might not get to the destination that we're trying to reach. So this is why the Buddha was so careful and laid out so beautifully the path and explained in detail the destination, so that we could be certain ourselves. So the suttas that we're looking at today come from the Buddha's first sermon, Buddha's first discourse. It's called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, or the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma. So this is a metaphor, a simile, I guess, where the Dhamma is referred to as a wheel that has been turned. So this is why we see in the Buddhist temples and Buddhist culture this symbol of the wheel, which is rolling forth. And this is the wheel that has rolled forth and has kept on rolling all the way until today. And we are part of this dispensation, the Buddha's sasana, the Buddha's dispensation. His teaching has reached us even today. And this all goes back to that very first discourse that he gave after his enlightenment. And there was a moment, as I mentioned last night, where he wasn't sure if he wanted to teach this Dhamma. He thought it would be very difficult for people to understand, difficult to see. He could have remained what's called a Pacceka Buddha, a private Buddha, an enlightened being who just hangs out by themselves, enjoying the bliss of enlightenment, and doesn't get involved with the humans and all their problems and all of their personalities and issues and dramas and whatever. He could have just hidden away from the world, but he decided, out of compassion, to teach. So after he left the area, the place where he got enlightened under that Bodhi tree, he was thinking, oh, who should I go and teach? So he was wandering down the road, and he actually encountered someone, an ascetic, a sage, and they kind of got chatting, and the Buddha was like, oh yeah, I'm enlightened. And this person was like, oh yeah, okay, may it be so, like, see ya. Kind of like, didn't believe the Buddha, didn't believe that he had attained this goal, and just turned his back on the Buddha and left. Missed opportunity, right? So perhaps the Buddha hadn't quite perfected his teaching method, right? Maybe it took some time to work out how to present this information. And so when it comes not too long after the time that the Buddha got enlightened, he went back to his old friends, his old buddies, who he used to meditate with when he was still unenlightened, when he was a bodhisattva, a being intent on enlightenment. And he was striving with these ascetics to attain enlightenment, and they were hardcore. These were the kind of people who really pushed themselves, they were really striving. And at that time, the Buddha too was doing this. And so we see an image of the Buddha sometimes in Buddhist sculpture called the fasting Buddha, where the Buddha is like really gaunt in his face, his eyes are really sunken, his cheeks are hollow, you can see all of his ribs, and his stomach is barely there. This is when he was pushing himself really hard in this search for enlightenment. Thought that you could get there through pain and suffering, that if you could just burn up all that pain and suffering, you'd end up with bliss and enlightenment. However, he discovered that this wasn't the right way. And he was only eating like 1 grain of rice every 3 days or something, So you can imagine that kind of mind, right? It doesn't sound like the kind of mind that can do a lot of like investigation into the nature of reality. And so those ascetics that he was hanging out with before his enlightenment, they were all like this kind of hardcore ascetic. So when they saw him coming after he had changed his ways and had eaten well and had rested and taken care of his body, restored his strength, and because of doing that, was able to become enlightened under the Bodhi tree. When they saw him coming, they were like really dissing him, and they wanted to kind of like ignore him and treat him mean, to like teach him a lesson. But he had such amazing, strong energy that they found themselves unable to carry out that plan. And so this is the scene that we often see in temples of the Buddha delivering the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta to these 5 bhikkhus. And it's in the deer park at Isipatane, Patna. And there we see the deer, we see the 5 bhikkhus, and we see the Buddha giving this teaching. And so this is what we're looking at here. And it begins by the Buddha saying there are these 2 extremes. One is that extreme towards self-mortification that he had been engaging with before his enlightenment, that these bhikkhus also had been engaging in. So he wants you to avoid that extreme of self-mortification, punishing yourself, punishing your body. The other extreme is the extreme of indulging in sense desire and enjoying sensual pleasures, like, having a glass of wine and pizza in a jacuzzi or something, This is not going to lead to enlightenment. Sure, we see those images of the Buddha kind of fasting before his enlightenment. That's like a don't do this way. We don't see any images of the Buddha like getting massaged or these kinds of things. But he's always speaking about avoiding sensual pleasures, because these are the things that take us away from our spiritual practice, right? That prevent us from even making it to the cushion. Watching that next show on Netflix, going to a fancy dinner party, getting really drunk and being hungover. These are things that get in the way of your spiritual practice, right? These are things that get to stop you from sitting down on the cushion. And when you're on the cushion, make you get up and leave your meditation practice to go and have that piece of chocolate cake or whatever. And so he wants us to avoid these two extremes. And so this is the way he begins talking to those monks. And then he needs to tell them that he's achieved this thing. And this is the definition. Sorry, I'll just go back a step. He needs to tell them that he has made it, that he's done it, that he's got the goods, that he's able to let them know what enlightenment is. And so that experience of enlightenment that the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree was where he gained knowledge and insight. And when we talk about this moment of getting these knowledges and insights, the Buddha talked about it in terms of three knowledges called the Vejjasala, three enlightenment knowledges. So I just mention them very briefly, because this is basically what defined his experience of enlightenment. These are the things that for the Buddha count as enlightenment knowledge. So the first is the knowledge of suffering, dukkha, and seeing countless rebirths, going back and back and back and back and back and back without being able to see a beginning point. And so this is suffering, this is dukkha. This is the cycle of samsara, this endless cycle of being reborn and suffering and getting reborn again over and over again. And so this is the Buddha's insight into the true nature of suffering. So perhaps we think we have a bad day. Woe is me. The suffering involved in trying to get that Excel spreadsheet to work, or having to endure yet another Zoom meeting, the pain, the torment. But when the Buddha talked about suffering, he wasn't just talking about these sorts of things. He was talking about that incredibly long cycle of suffering that we've been enduring for so long. This pain of being born, getting old, getting sick, dying, over and over and over again. And this is what he saw in those moments before his enlightenment, this understanding of the true nature of suffering. The second enlightenment knowledge is knowing the causes of beings' rebirth in various realms, in various ways. So this is the understanding of karma, that beings are reborn according to their karma. So when the Buddha saw those lifetimes going back and back and back, he didn't see that beings were always born as human. He saw that they were born in different states, animal realms, hell realms, heavenly realms, and they're born in these places because of their actions. And it's our ignorance of understanding the link between cause and effect, our ignorance in understanding karma, that leads us to behave in ways that lead to bad results for us, or good results, depending on our intentional actions, our karma. And so he saw that beings are born as a result of their karma. So this was the second knowledge that he had, and this is why the Buddha teaches things like ethical conduct, the benefits of good actions like generosity and kindness, and why we should develop our mind. These are things that the Buddha taught to help us avoid being reborn in bad destinations and incline our mind towards goodness and wholesomeness so that we have the best chance for good rebirth, good conditions for understanding how we can transform our mind that leads to liberation. So this is that second insight. He saw that knowledge of karma, why beings are reborn in different places in different ways. Then the third enlightenment knowledge was the knowledge of the ending of the asavas. This is like the outflowings, the defilements that we produce. And these he saw as ending. This is also known as the taints, the things that kind of taint our existence. And so he saw those ending, and he had knowledge and vision of his release, of his freedom. And this is enlightenment. So if you're wondering if you're enlightened, like if you're not sure, then you probably haven't had this knowledge that it's ended, that there's no more, that you've done the job, that you are enlightened, and you know that you are free. Because you can see that there's nothing left to create a future rebirth. You've escaped that round of suffering in samsara. And this is what enlightenment is. So let's look at how he talked about this when he was chatting with the bhikkhus, the 5 bhikkhus, in the deer park. And so he says, my knowledge and vision arose in me. My freedom is unshakable. This is my last rebirth. Now then, there'll be no more future lives. So this is akupa me vimukti ayam antima jati natidani punarbhavoti. Jati, birth. There's no more birth. So this is what the Buddha talked about when he talked about enlightenment. And he goes on to define it in terms of cessation of suffering. So this is a way that we can understand what enlightenment is. It's that escape from suffering. It's defined in this kind of negative term, like, suffering, escape from suffering. But this is happiness, right? This is like, if you're not suffering, then you're happy. But we'll look at some more positive terms later on, and we'll understand a bit more about the reason why the Buddha said this is the highest bliss. Imagine you've been suffering and then you stop suffering. Nice, right? We get to see this, a taste of this in our meditation, right? We get a taste of this, a taste of the cessation, a taste of the ending of suffering. And it's nice, right? That's why in the guided meditation I advise you to relax your body. Yeah? Sometimes you see meditators are like this, like they're so tight, they're so tense, they're trying so hard, they end up just getting really overwrought, and they've got a lot of pain in their body, and they get a headache, and so they end up just suffering more, right? But it's possible, as perhaps you've seen, when you relax and soften, to let go of suffering. We learn a lot in this experience of creating what's called kaya passaddhi, bodily tranquility. This bodily tranquility shows us that it's possible to move from a state of holding on to tension and tightness, holding on to suffering, to letting go. And that in that letting go, there is a movement away from suffering towards a feeling of comfort and ease. The more you let go of suffering, the more that comfort and ease turns into joy and rapture and bliss, happiness, right? So the more we let go of suffering, the more bliss we have. And this is what we start to experience in our meditation practice. Oh, when I let go of that thinking, that agitation, that busyness, that distraction, then there's peace. And the peace is sweet and beautiful. Yeah? And it transforms into that deep bliss that leads to very deep states of meditation. And so in our meditation practice, we actually see this transformation of the mind. This is the whole path, this movement from suffering to happiness. And so we get a taste of it in our meditation practice. We can maybe start to make an analogy to the Buddha's experience of enlightenment when all the suffering is gone and finished. Wouldn't that be nice, right? Be pretty good. And so the Buddha goes on to talk about suffering. He talks about this in terms of the Four Noble Truths, which I think most of you will be aware of. So for those who don't know, Four Noble Truths are, or we can do this together perhaps, show our learning. First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering. There we go, see? So this is what the Buddha teaches in this sutta, in this first teaching. He says, there is suffering. And second noble truth, cause of suffering. So that's good to know, right? So not only did he identify the problem, he tells us the reasons that we suffer. And there are 3 reasons that cause us suffering. And these are craving, yeah? Craving. Craving for what? First one, kama tanha. Craving for sensual pleasures. Yes. Takes us away from our meditation practice, distracts us. Causes so much suffering in the world. People fighting in Maya over Boxing Day deals. Craving for sensual pleasures, right? Anyway. Then the second craving, bhava tanha, the craving for existence. We want to keep on going around in bodies. We like it. We want more and more existence. So we're caught up in this pattern of desiring existence, but within that we suffer a great deal. Some of you have discovered this already, just this morning, how difficult it is to have a body, right? Oh, it hurts, it aches, it gets cold. But we still have this, we don't want it to disappear, do we? We want to keep it for a little while. If someone's like, well, my leg hurts, well, we'll cut it off. No, we still want this body, right? And this is desire for existence is what keeps us stuck in this round of samsara. And the third craving, vibhava tanha, craving for annihilation, just wishing it would all go away. Kind of closing your eyes and like pretending doesn't work that way. You can't just get rid of it by not wanting it. This craving for annihilation. This is the cause of our suffering, just not wanting to exist, not wanting to deal with it. So this is the cause of suffering. The third noble truth. This is starting to get to the good part. It's been bad news so far. The third noble truth. The cessation of suffering. So this is nice to know. The Buddha found a way that suffering ceases. That is awakening, enlightenment, Nibbana, the cessation of suffering. See how awakening is the ending of suffering. And the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to that cessation of suffering. So there's a way, there's a path, there's a journey that takes us to the cessation of suffering that is enlightenment. And so when he talks about what enlightenment is, that cessation of suffering, this is the third noble truth. The cessation of suffering is enlightenment. And he talks about it and he says, now this is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. And then in detail, it's the fading away and cessation of that very same craving, those three types of craving: craving for sensual pleasures, craving to exist, craving to not exist. It's the fading away and cessation of that very same craving with nothing left over, giving it away, letting it go, releasing it, and not adhering to it. So yesterday when I asked you for your one word for enlightenment, some of you mentioned some of these words, right? Some of you mentioned cessation, you mentioned the remainderless, right? You said, and this is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, remainderless, fading away with nothing left over. And Bhante Sujata's translation here is, nothing left over, giving it away, letting it go, releasing it, and not adhering to it. So it's that fading away. Remember that term I mentioned just before, viraga, nirodho, cessation of that same craving. Giving it away, chago. So often we think of chaga as like generosity. It's like giving it away here. Letting it go, patinisaga. Releasing it, mutti, and not adhering to it, analayo. These are the words that the Buddha uses to describe this experience of enlightenment. And if you turn back to the previous page, you see that some of these words we find in that upasamanussati, that recollection of peace, the recollection of the qualities of Nibbana. We see words like the stilling of all activities, the letting go of all attachments, the ending, the cessation of craving, dispassion, that's viraga, fading away, cessation, extinguishment. So this is the way that the Buddha talked about enlightenment. And he gives us that path that leads to enlightenment. And this is called the middle way between those two extremes of self-mortification and indulging in sensual pleasures. The middle way between those two extremes, what is it? The path that leads to enlightenment is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so that's our map. That's our map for the journey towards enlightenment. And so he says, he's talking in the third person here, the Tathagata, the realized one, woke up by understanding this middle way of practice, which gives vision and knowledge and leads to peace. Remember that word peace? Peace is upasama. Upasamanussati is that practice that we looked at. It leads to peace, direct knowledge, awakening and extinguishment. So the Tathagata woke up by understanding the middle way of practice, which gives vision and knowledge. Chaku karani, jnana karani, upasamaya, peace, abhinya, direct knowledge, sambodhi, awakening, nibbana, extinguishment, enlightenment. And then he goes on to say, what is that middle way of practice? It's that Noble Eightfold Path. And this Noble Eightfold Path, the 8 factors, he gives them here. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. And so this is the way that we can get to enlightenment, by following this Noble Eightfold Path. So 3 parts of that, of course, are in meditation practice: right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. But those other aspects have to do with our ethical conduct and our ability to have some wisdom, that right view and that right intention. This is a wisdom aspect of the path. Perhaps I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. But it's this middle way of practice, he says, which gives vision and knowledge, leads to peace, direct knowledge, awakening and extinguishment. So if you hear people talking about enlightenment, awakening, and they haven't followed this Eightfold Path, if they don't have good ethical conduct, if they don't have good bodily conduct, if they steal or kill, or if they lie and cheat, then probably you can say they're not actually enlightened. So it's really good to check out people and their actions and to see, them clearly, so that you can make this assessment. And it's really difficult for us to do these days because we often don't have physical contact with a teacher, and we listen to teachers online, or we see them on YouTube. We don't get to see them and the way they live, the way they behave, the way they act outside of that little YouTube video. And so we want to be careful. We want to make sure that we have a very high standard of who we trust when it comes to enlightenment. And that's why it's good to understand what the Buddha meant when he talked about enlightenment. And during that discourse, when the Buddha was talking to those 5 ascetics in the deer park, there was a moment when one of them got it. Remember last night I was talking about those 5 opportunities for freedom? Do you remember what they were? Listening to the Dhamma, right? So the first one, listening to the Dhamma. This moment when the wheel of Dhamma was being turned. That first discourse of the enlightened being, the Buddha, who discovered this path all by himself. So for us, it's so easy. He came along, said, here's the problem, here's the solution, this is the way you go from there to there. Easy, right? We're so fortunate, we're so lucky. Still, it's quite difficult, but certainly easier than never having heard the Dhamma before, right? This is why sometimes, you get so emotional thinking how wonderful it is that the Buddha gave these teachings, how fortunate we are to have them. And in this age where it's impossible to give away a free Dharma book, no one wants them, they're just gathering dust. And when there's so many YouTube channels and so many Dharma talks every night of the week, maybe we have lost some of that kind of awe, that wow factor for how precious these teachings actually are. I remember when I was younger and I saw a free Dharma book, I'd always grab it because I was so hungry and thirsty for the Dharma. I knew the power it had to transform my mind. And when there was a Dharma teaching, I'd really make effort to go. Where things have changed a little bit now. There's so much Dharma, but maybe we don't value it in the same way. At the time of the Buddha, people would walk days to hear a teaching from the Buddha. Hundreds of years later, Chinese pilgrims would cross the deserts. As Bhante Akaliko often says, the only guide they had was the corpses of the people who went before them who didn't make it. They're traveling across the deserts because they valued the teaching so much that this is what they did. And so this is the power of hearing the Dhamma. It'll change your life. And for many of you, hearing the Dhamma did change your life. Having a spiritual practice has transformed you. And so you should be very appreciative, very grateful for this, because otherwise you'd be running around just like the rest of them, and with a very uncontrolled mind. You have actually made a lot of progress on the path. So that's good. And so when the Buddha was speaking to these 5 ascetics in the deer park, one of them got it. And his name was Kondanya. And this is really good to know. And I'm sure the Buddha was quite happy to know this too, because he saw, he gets it. He gets it. He saw that his teaching had the power to take people from suffering to freedom. That's an amazing thing. He saw that he had the skill and the knowledge to teach others. Must have been quite satisfying, I imagine. But the importance for us is that this means that we too have the same potential as Kondanya. And so that was the moment that we get the 3 jewels. We have the Buddha, his teachings, and then we get the Sangha. Remember this, when we talk about the 3 jewels, it's always the Arya Sangha, the community of enlightened beings who have understood the Buddha's teachings for themselves and that means they've made some progress to enlightenment. They've attained stream entry or beyond. I'll talk about those stages of enlightenment later. But this shows that it's possible for there to be a community of enlightened beings, and it's possible for us to become a part of that community. And that's why the Buddha taught, so that beings could come out of suffering and have freedom, so that we could escape this cycle of samsara. And this is the goal. And it's not an unachievable goal. It's something that is possible. And many beings in the past have broken through, have crossed to the far shore, have attained enlightenment. And so this is something to keep in mind. That's why this first teaching of the Buddha is so precious. It not only shows his knowledge of awakening, what causes suffering, how to escape it, but his ability to teach others, to teach us this path. This is why he was known as Satta Deva Manussanam, the teacher of gods and humans. This is his power, his ability to transform our minds with his knowledge so that we don't have to find it out for ourselves. We can just piggyback on his awakening experience. And this is what makes him a Sammasambuddha, a Buddha that discovered the path for himself and teaches it, and which distinguishes the Buddha from those Pacceka Buddhas, those private Buddhas, who couldn't teach, or didn't want to teach, didn't have the faculty for being the teacher of gods and humans. This is what distinguishes our Buddha from those other enlightened beings. He discovered the path for himself and he taught it. And so here we have Venerable Kondanya's insight. And again, it's an insight into cessation, into the ending of things. while this discourse was being spoken, the stainless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma arose in Venerable Kondanya. Everything that has a beginning has an end. So this is about the potential for stopping, for ending. And this is the kind of thing that we start to see in our meditation practice too. Like, thoughts can't go forever. Eventually, the mind tires out and they stop, right? And then you have these moments of peace and incredible quietness in your mind. And even that also isn't permanent and changes. But we start to understand what leads to those changes in the mind. We start to understand what leads to that agitation and that suffering, that thinking, that busyness. It's you doing the craving, wanting to have some entertainment in your mind, thinking about chocolate cake, thinking about your nice comfortable bed, stirring up your mind, yeah? Wanting to be busy, wanting to have a restless mind, or being agitated. Why can't I just stop? Why can't I do it? Not wanting to be there, not wanting to endure your poor mind, right? To escape it. This is what stirs up all of that craving in your mind that leads to suffering. So when we start to understand what leads to suffering and what leads away from suffering, that's when we start to make progress on the path. And the crucible for this learning, the place we do this learning, the place of understanding, the place where we see it, is in meditation, when we have a microscope on our mind. This is why we need to develop that mindfulness that sees clearly what's going on right here, right now. We need that mindfulness to tell us what is going on. We need that data, that information. And then we need some discernment, some wisdom to understand, is what's going on useful or not useful? Is it good or bad? Is it skillful or unskillful? This knowledge relies upon understanding where our intentions, our mental activities will take our mind. Understanding the matrix of our thoughts. And this is yoniso manasikara, wise attention. Yoniso, yoni, the matrix, the womb, the beginning place of our thoughts, our intentions, our actions and activities of the mind. Manasikara, attention, wise attention, is required so that we can understand what leads to good results and what leads away from good results in our meditation practice. This is how we develop the mind, transform the mind through our meditation, why meditation is so powerful. And just to finish this little section, and to remind you of the potential for beings to come out of suffering. It wasn't just Venerable Kondanya who got it. It was many beings. And so we even have so many suttas, so many people, so many characters from the time of the Buddha and beyond who attained enlightenment. And in the suttas, we have this kind of stock phrase, standard text that comes up. And this one here is taken from the Anatalakkhana Sutta. And I included a bit beforehand where it talks about not self, which is, of course, one of those important Buddhist teachings, that there is no fixed, permanent, stable self. It's always changing, that it arises because of conditions. And this seeing through not self is overcoming one of the fetters that prevent us from attaining enlightenment. And that is this view of self, Sakkaya Ditthi. This view of self that we cling to prevents us from seeing the true nature of ourself, the true nature of our existence, our reality. But this is what the Buddha saw at those moments of enlightenment, that this idea of ourself, it actually, this body, this mind, it's impermanent, it's changing. He saw back and back and back these lifetimes, the consciousness arising in different places, in different bodies, in different times, eating this food, doing that job, being with that family, existing in this plane, existing on that plane. And this knowledge, of course, if you could see that, would fundamentally make you think differently about your concept of self, right? So in this Anatta Sutta, the Buddha is trying to describe this understanding of the true nature of ourself, that it's conditioned, impermanent, that we can't control it. And so here the Buddha is talking, he says, you should see any kind of consciousness at all, past, future and present, internal or external, coarse or fine, inferior or superior, far or near, all consciousness with right understanding. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Seeing this, a learned noble disciple grows disillusioned with form, feeling, perception, choices and consciousness, that's the 5 khandhas. Being disillusioned, desire fades away. When desire fades away, they're freed. So once again, when desire and craving is extinguished, is let go of, when it fades away, freedom is the result. When they're freed, they know they're freed. That's that knowledge and vision of release. That third tevijja, that third enlightenment knowledge. And then this is the stock standard phrase, the cry of the enlightened being, the roar of the enlightened being. They understand rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done. There is no return to any state of existence. So that sentence in bold is that stock phrase of the Arahant, someone who has completed the Noble Eightfold Path, that journey to enlightenment, to completion. Rebirth is ended. You're out of that cycle of being born, suffering and dying. That spiritual journey, the brahmacharya, has been completed. What had to be done has been done. Kind of like tick. Yeah. There is no return to any state of existence. You've been spat out of samsara. And it's important to mention that Nibbana, enlightenment, is not some sort of heavenly realm, some sort of place where you just get to hang out and be blissful. It's that remainderless fading away with nothing left over. There's nothing left over. And this is why that craving for existence is suffering. You want to keep on existing, you can't escape suffering. Escaping suffering means you no longer exist, you're gone, vanished. We'll see some similes to help us understand what this actually means later, and it's very difficult to get our heads around. Some people want Nibbana to be like a heavenly realm where they can just hang out in bliss and be happy. But that heavenly realm couldn't last. It has to change. And so then you'd find yourself suffering again. So this can't be Nibbana, this kind of existence. The only kind of thing that can be enlightenment, escape from this round of suffering, this round of samsara, the only way it can be freedom from suffering is to no longer be born. And this is why it's called the deathless. Not because it's eternal, but because there's no more birth. When there's no more birth, there's no more death. That's why it's the deathless. So this is a little bit about the way the Buddha himself defined enlightenment. And so this is why this weekend I'm teaching this upasana nusati, this recollection of peace, this recollection of stilling. These are the qualities of Nibbana. So let's just remind ourselves one more time what that is. So it's on the first page at the bottom there. So this is upasama nusati, the recollection of peace, or the recollection of stilling, the qualities of Nibbana. This is peaceful. Right? So we can associate our experience of peace with the experience of Nibbana. We get a taste of peace. That's what Nibbana would be like. This is sublime. Right? It's pretty good. It's not average. It's not dull. It's sublime. It's wonderful. It's amazing. And again, just to go back, sometimes to make sure we know who is enlightened and who is not, when you hear people talking about their enlightenment experience and they're like, yeah, and after that I had a sandwich and I kind of went to the movies, and you think, well, it doesn't sound like it was all that exciting. Like enlightenment is not something you do on a Wednesday afternoon before footy practice. It's something that will knock your socks off, and so it's not boring, it's not average, it's not a small thing. And there are so many people out there claiming to be enlightened, and they're like, yeah, actually it was pretty boring, And I was like, not how I heard about the Buddha talking about it. This is sublime. That is the stilling of all activities. That's the sankharas, the stilling of all activities. Everything just becoming still, no movement. Imagine that, how beautiful that would be. And maybe you've tasted this in your practice, where your mind, just for a second, just for a moment, is so still. And it's so blissful. You don't want anything. You don't want to move. You're just still. Things have stopped. And the Buddha talks about this stilling of the sankharas, like a person who's walking really fast. And then they suddenly think, why am I walking fast? Why don't I slow down? So they start walking slowly. And they think, why am I walking slow? Why don't I stand still? So they stand still. Why don't I sit down? Why am I sitting? Why don't I lie down? So each of these postures becomes successively more comfortable, more at ease, right? More restful. In the same way, our mind and our mental activities move. You see this in your meditation. From that activity, that busyness, walking fast, right? Thinking about this, thinking about that. And then you're like, what am I doing? Torturing myself. And you're like, go, relax, let go, calm down. You start to see these activities becoming more and more restful. You're moving from walking fast to standing still to lying down. This is the way the activities of the mind become still. And it's possible. You see it in your meditation. The letting go of all attachments. So when you hear Bhante Akaliko saying, letting go, it's so easy to say, right? It's so difficult to do. You are attached. That's why it's difficult to let go. You want to be attached to these things. These things interest you, they matter to you, they help create yourself. They don't matter to anyone else. It's all about you and your attachments. These are the things that make up you. The Buddha said if you have one attachment, you have one suffering. If you have two attachments, two suffering. Three attachments, three sufferings. Many sufferings we have. And you see this in your mind. Why can't I stop thinking about work? Why am I still missing my partner? Why am I bothered about this thing or that thing? Or why am I doing the things that interest me or attract me? These are the things that start to disturb your meditation. And you see that the amount of attachments you have causes a lot of suffering in your mind. Right? So imagine if you were able to let these go, and when you do let go, you see actually there's some bliss that comes from letting go. Holding on, or reaching out and holding on to those things, clinging to them, is suffering. Letting go is bliss, happiness, freedom. Even just in that moment of meditation, like you can still have your partner and your job and all that, but just in your meditation, you learn how to let go. And this is why I teach that letting go practice. All my teachers who are really good at meditation, they talk about the art of letting go. How important it is to learn letting go. And when you see how to let go, then it's always possible for you to do so. And as I said yesterday, this is what transforms your mind from like an amateur to a professional. You understand the trick. That's the trick. Let go, right? Stop craving. Stop reaching out, grabbing on, holding, getting stuck and clinging to this stuff. That's the trick. So yes, letting go of all attachments. And then the ending of craving. Not wanting anything. Being free from craving. It's that mental energy of restlessness, of desire, that movement of the mind towards an object or running away from an object is not pleasant. That movement towards wanting, that movement away from but is not wanting. This is how our mind is when it's untrained, when we crave. When we let go, we end that cycle of craving. We no longer have that energy, that agitation in the mind. And then we have this dispassion, the fading away. We see this in our practice. We're no longer interested in that stuff, those attachments, that craving. We started to learn, even at a very subconscious level, that's a cause of suffering for me. If we've got any wisdom, then we recognize that, and we're like, and then it fades. That passion, that raga, that cause of our interest becomes viraga, dispassion, fading away. And when you feel this in your meditation, it's like that movement from agitation, distraction, excitement towards stillness and peace. You're starting to experience how that happens. And then you get the cessation. You start to see things ending, right? In your meditation, you see things ending. You see things disappear. I remember Ajahn Brahm saying, I'm interested in endings, not beginnings. You know? And it's a very profound thing. You know, when things end, that's cessation, nirodha. We're not creating new things. We're letting go of the old. And this is how the That third tevijja, the cessation of the taints, the outflowings, the asavas, when this has ended, there's nothing more. There's no beginnings. There's only endings. And that's what is Nibbana, extinguishment. So that's the Buddha's definition of enlightenment and his practice of Upassana no Sati. So we've got a few moments until lunch. Perhaps we just take a few moments to do that second opportunity for freedom. The fourth opportunity for freedom. The pondering, thinking about what we just learnt, remembering it for ourselves. Let's just take a few moments with our eyes closed to think about some of the things that we just read. What does it mean to you to think about the Buddha's definition of enlightenment? These words, cessation, dispassion, fading away. What would it mean for craving to be gone, to end? Why is it peaceful? Think about these things. Ponder them. Are you attached to the idea of lunch? Are you craving food? What can we do? Well, you can ponder these things anytime. And after the meal today, you'll have this opportunity for doing some pondering. You can spend some time helping out, doing some mindfulness tasks after lunch. I think the sign-up board's already on the wall and people probably put their names down. Thank you so much for looking after this place so that we can come here and practice like this. It's so nice and clean. A lot of work involved in having a place. A lot of attachments, a lot of problems. And after that, you can do some rest, some walking around, some being in the forest. You can walk around and you can ponder. You can do some more meditation. Do whatever you want. It's your time. And then at 1 o'clock? 2 o'clock?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. 2 o'clock we come back here, we'll do some more meditation, and we'll just continue going on like that. So let's go and we'll do a little ceremony for the lunch, and after that you can do pondering, mindfulness tasks, relaxing, more meditation.